Okay, let's get started with the essentials of hospital economics. And we'll start with the revenue cycle management, the entire cycle from starting your business until you generate a return. When a company draws up a specific project plan, right, for a particular project, then financial estimates or financial analysts, estimate what is known as the ROI or the return on investment. You would have heard this all the time for that particular project. Now, this is based on a business plan that surrounds that particular project. To be profitable, that particular project or all projects must generate a return on their investments, ROI, which is greater than their weighted average cost of capital, WACC. Right? Now, this is for a specific project. Now, when that project is in an ongoing steady state operations, management also look at other metrics. One such metrics is called ROS or return on sales. Return on sales is basically a metric that provides us with a glimpse into the P&L, profit and loss behavior of a particular system, a hospital system in this case. Another metric that management closely looks at is ROA, return on assets. This is a metric that gives us a view into how efficiently does the operations utilize the assets at its disposal. And this is one of the metrics of the strength of the balance sheet of a hospital system. Another metric that you will keep hearing, especially with financial analysts and investment bankers and those types, is EBITDA. It stands for EBITDA, and basically is short for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Right? Now, with that background of some basic terminologies, and most of them you already know, but I just wanted to set the context for the benefit of everybody. Let us look at this entire cycle or the investment cycle, and it'll be easier if I just walk you through a particular slide. Okay, let's jump into it right away. Okay, we now get into the return on investment cycle or the ROI cycle. We will traverse from the right to the left of this exhibit as I walk you through the different modules and the steps that lead to the generation of returns from the operational activities that a hospital undertakes. To start with, we will go from right to left at the bottom, which will be the ROS cycle. You remember I spoke about return on sales, which is a metric that gives you a glimpse of the strength of the P&L and gives you how the P&L behaves. That will go from right to the left at the bottom of the screen. And then after this, we will go through the ROA cycle, the return on investment cycle, also the return on asset cycle, which is a metric that tells you how efficiently operations has utilized the assets that is at the disposal of the hospital, right? Okay, so you have costs, and costs come in the form of drugs, in the form of materials, in the form of extra hours of people that are hired, and all of this contribute to what is known as the variable costs. Now, this is vastly simplified. I'm just trying to give you a view into the different components. So these are variable costs, and they are variable costs because they vary with business volume. So in a hospital, generally materials, drugs, etc., all of this mean that more patients means more drugs, more material consumption, more hours, more services, etc. And therefore, these are variable costs. Now, you also have another type of costs, and those are fixed costs. Doesn't matter what is the level of the OPD, doesn't matter what is the level of the IPD, doesn't matter the ICU occupancy, intensive care occupancy, or any other numbers, there are certain fixed costs and overheads like administrative costs, maintenance costs, other staff costs that remain the same, right? And these costs together make up the fixed costs. Okay. Now, just a moment here. We can further dissect these costs into two levels, meaning we can dissect these into costs that can be directly associated with or traced to individual patients. It's normally not done, but when we speak about costing and the lack of sophistication in costing in hospitals, and we will be recommending a particular type of costing methodology, and this bit of information will become relevant at that time. So you can actually trace some of these costs directly to individual patients. And that way, you will have 4 different cost categories. You will have variable direct and variable indirect costs. You will have fixed direct and you'll have fixed indirect costs, right? So just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind another point, that it is mainly the variable direct costs that play a meaningful role in real actual cost control and other measurement efforts. And we will visit all of this later when we get into costs and costing. Okay, now these two costs, fixed and variable, together form the overall expenditure of the hospital. Accountants sometimes also refer to this as COGS, or cost of goods sold, right? Now, all of this is done to generate revenue, which is also called turnover. And where does this turnover come from? These hospital revenues or turnover comes from inpatient incomes, right? These include rental incomes, these include operating room incomes, procedure incomes. You have incomes from emergency, you have incomes from OPDs. Of course, all of this is simplified, but it gives you the top line, right? So all of this together, some additional incomes, all of this together form in a tertiary hospital, all of this together forms the turnover or the revenue of the hospital. When you take the expenditures out of the turnover or the revenue, you end up with what is known as EBITDA or EBITDA, a metric that we mentioned earlier. Just a couple of points here. Depending on the type of hospital and location, you may find that the OP and emergency revenues can vary significantly. I also want to make a point that pharmacy, operating rooms, and ICUs generally tend to contribute very significantly to revenues in a tertiary care hospital. Okay? And also, there seems to be a strong correlation between the level of complexity of care delivered and the profitability or revenues of a hospital enterprise. Okay, anyway, we've now come to a point where we know we've got all these expenditures from the fixed and the variable costs. We've generated revenue from inpatient, outpatient, and other incomes. And once you take the expenditures away from turnover, you end up with EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. When you take away interest, you pay off your interest and you pay off your amortization. Depreciation is a non-cash expense. You are left with what is known as earnings before, profit before taxation, right? And this is also called PBT. And when you take PBT divided by your total revenue, you get a metric which is the efficiency of how sales has performed and how your balance sheet behaves. So PBT divided by the overall revenue gives you return on sales. So this, my friends, is basically a very, very simplified version of the return on sales, okay? Which is a glimpse of how well the profit and loss statement of a hospital behaves. Okay? Now let us look at, on the top, there are some balance sheet items, right? Now you have supplies, inventory, you have accounts receivables, either from the insurance companies or from patients that have credits with you. You have a lot of liquid assets in the form of liquid inventory, in the form of cash. And all of this together form what is known as the circulating capital or the working capital, right? And you also have in a hospital a lot of plant, a lot of machinery, your large MRIs, your large CT machines, the plant, the building, the chiller systems, all of this form the fixed assets, right? And when you add both of the fixed assets and the circulating capital together, you get overall capital, right? And you already have generated turnover or revenue from these operations. And when you divide this by the overall capital, you get asset turnover or return on assets, which is basically a metric that demonstrates how well assets were utilized, right? And this is why hospital managements are always particular about resource utilization and how well they sweat their fixed assets. So you will always find the pressure to sweat the MRI and sweat that radiotherapy machine and sweat the CT machine, etc. It's because that those fixed costs are such a drain that if they are not adequately turned around in terms of utilization, then there's a problem. And we will examine this when we get into what I call the fixed cost dilemma of hospitals. Okay, there are a couple of other metrics just as we get to the end of this slide. It's called, you've heard of occupancy. So people will ask, what's the occupancy in the hospital? Or they would say, what is the average length of stay in the hospital, ALOS? Now, these two metrics are also something that management looks closely into. And what's the reason for this? You see, typically in a tertiary quaternary care hospital, you will notice that the bulk of the patient billing and the bulk of the revenue happens up front. So it's in the first few days when the patient is admitted to the hospital that you have all the investigations and the procedures and the surgeries and all of that stuff. And after all of this, there's a brief stay in the ICU, after which the patient is generally in the ward for observation, waiting for discharge. And when they are in the room, they're mostly just paying room rent, right? So during this time, the hospitals want to make sure that they also keep looking at ALOS, the average length of stay, so that they can turn around their beds faster and improve throughput. They just want to make sure, though, that in their enthusiasm to make more revenue, they must also guard against a discharged patient being readmitted, due to some complications because, you were just too keen to turn the bed over. Anyway, these are some of the areas where the balance between good medicine and good economics comes into focus. There are also other metrics like ARPOB, ARPOB, or average revenue per operating bed, which is also used to review a hospital's operational and financial performance, right? So this slide, in a very simplified manner, illustrates to you and gives you a guided tour of the return on sales, how the P&L behaves, the return on assets, how the balance sheet behaves, and how you have to generate an ROI, which hopefully is greater than your weighted average cost of capital. Let us now move to understanding and basically taking a quick look at how the revenue and cost structures of a typical tertiary care hospital behave. I just want to make a small observation that some of these figures that I'm going to share with you are only indicative, they're illustrative, and they might have a very strong emerging market slant. But it's just to give you an idea, and let's get into the revenue and cost structures in a bit. See you on the other side.